Welcome to The Dark Docket, the podcast where we explore the fascinating intersection between the law, the supernatural, and the unnatural. I'm your host, Aiden, and tonight we're going to make a slight departure from our usual subject matter. In previous episodes, we focused on legal cases that involved entities and forces that were not of this world. However, the world we live in is scary enough without references to ghosts and ghouls. In fact, it would be remiss of us to not consider how human behavior can be just as horrifying as any specter. So tonight, grab some silverware, tuck in your napkins, and ready your plates as I dish out some tasty tales of cannibalism in court cases. Before we get into the meat of the matter, let's sink our teeth into our normal disclaimer. Nothing you hear on this show should be construed as legal advice. If you're facing a legal issue, please consult with a qualified attorney duly licensed in the appropriate state. Furthermore, while we strive for accuracy, we can't guarantee the complete historical validity of all facts and stories presented. Some details may be dramatized or simplified for narrative effect. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. But remember, we're here to spark your imagination, not to solve your ghostly legal disputes. One final word of warning: this episode will contain references to cannibalism and acts of violence that some may find disturbing. Therefore, parental guidance is advised. Throughout history, the taboo of cannibalism has manifested itself in various circumstances, often driven by desperation, cultural practices, or individual pathology. In antiquity, cannibalism was not uncommon. During the siege of Soyang in 757 CE, the city defenders reportedly consumed the bodies of up to 30,000 civilians. During the Crusades, in 1098, after capturing the Syrian city of Ma'ara, Christian soldiers allegedly engaged in cannibalism as a psychological warfare tactic. As European explorers ventured into the Americas, they encountered and sometimes participated in cannibalistic practices as well. For example, in colonial Jamestown, settlers resorted to cannibalism during the Starving Time of 1609 to 1610. The infamous Donner Party in 1846 resorted to eating their dead companions when snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains, not unlike the Uruguayan rugby team whose plane crashed in the Andes over a century later, forcing them to engage in cannibalism to survive for 72 days. Then, of course, during the siege of Leningrad in World War II, some starving residents turned to cannibalism to survive as well. Now, not all cannibalism was driven by desperation. Some societies incorporated it into their cultural or religious practices. The Aztecs, for instance, reportedly practiced cannibalism as part of their religious ceremonies. In New Guinea, until the mid-20th century, the Four people, believing that one would receive the blessing of a deceased person's spirit and absorb their talents and positive attributes, practiced funerary cannibalism. This practice also resulted in the spread of a prion disease called Kuru. And even to this day, the Aghoris, an Indian sect of gurus who worship the god Shiva, engage in post-mortem cannibalism, their belief being that all opposites are illusory. Hence, they engage in taboo acts that directly contradict and challenge notions of purity within the Orthodox Hindu tradition. With this being said, it seems almost inevitable that cannibalism would eventually become a subject for consideration by courts of law. In fact, as our first case will demonstrate, it was acts of cannibalism that led directly to the establishment of a key principle in common law. Picture this. It's May 19th, 1884. A yacht called the Mignonette set sail from Southampton, England, bound for Australia. The ship was not meant for long voyages, and it was embarking on a 15,000-mile journey. On board are only 4 men: Tom Dudley, the captain, Edwin Stevens, the first mate, Edmund Brooks, a sailor, and Richard Parker, a 17-year-old cabin boy. Little did they know that this voyage would lead them into a nightmare scenario and ultimately change the course of legal history. About 6 weeks into their journey, disaster struck. The Mignonette was hit by a massive rogue wave, capsizing the vessel. Our 4 protagonists barely had time to escape into a small lifeboat, salvaging only 2 tins of turnips and no fresh water. For days, they drifted in the vast expanse of the South Atlantic Ocean. They rationed their meager supplies and luckily caught a turtle for food, and even resorted to drinking their own urine. But as the days turned into weeks, their situation became increasingly desperate. The court's judgment would later paint a grim picture of the crew's dire circumstances. That on the 12th day, the remains of the turtle were entirely consumed, and for the next 8 days, they had nothing to eat. They had no fresh water except rain that they sometimes caught in their oilskin capes. By the 19th day, young Richard Parker had fallen ill from drinking seawater. It was then that Captain Dudley suggested the unthinkable, that they should draw lots to decide who would be sacrificed to save the others. Brooks refused to consent, the proposal was never presented to the ailing cabin boy, and the men ultimately did not draw lots. The following day, with no prospect of a rescue in sight, Dudley and Stevens made the decision for the group. They killed the unconscious Richard Parker and fed on his body for the next 4 days until they were finally rescued. Not long after their return to England, Dudley and Stevens were arrested and charged with murder. Now, to a modern audience, this development in the story should come as no surprise. A boy was killed and cannibalized. But to an audience from 1884, however, choosing to hold Dudley and Stevens responsible for their taboo actions would have actually run contrary to many people's expectations. In fact, there was a long history in maritime law of sailors having to resort to cannibalism under similar circumstances. The custom, known as the delicate question, would be raised when sailors found themselves in a disaster without provisions. The proper custom was for corpses to be eaten first, and then, if only the living were available, lots would be drawn, and the person with the short stick would be sacrificed to save the majority. Typically, such cases would not result in criminal charges unless someone rigged the process of drawing lots, or if drawing lots was neglected entirely. Sounds like an early version of the Korean show Squid Game. The survivors would return home, and given how accepted the practice was in the maritime community, many actually took to bragging about their ordeals. For survivors, engaging in the custom became a badge of honor, a testament to how tough and resilient they were in the face of certain death, although death was often more certain for non-crew members, slaves, children, and passengers when ship crews decided to actually put the custom into practice. A famous example of maritime cannibalism that happened prior to the Dudley and Stevens case occurred among the crew of the whaling ship the Essex, which sank after it was rammed by a whale in 1820. The story of the Essex went on to inspire Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. Also, none of the crew who engaged in cannibalism were brought up on charges. Returning to Dudley and Stevens, the court clearly had enough of hearing about barbaric tales of butchery at sea. The key question in this case was, could the extreme circumstances of the crew's survival justify the taking of an innocent life? On December 9th, 1884, Lord Chief Justice Coleridge delivered the court's decision. In a landmark ruling, the court found Dudley and Stevens guilty of murder, rejecting the defense of necessity. Lord Coleridge's words still resonate today. To preserve one's life is generally speaking a duty, but it may be the plainest and the highest duty to sacrifice it. The court further emphasized the moral implications of their decision. It is not needful to point out the awful danger of admitting the principle which is being contended for. Who is to be the judge of this sort of necessity? By what measure is the comparative value of lives to be measured? The court also distinguished the notion of killing in self-defense from the defense of necessity by relying on the words of the highly influential Lord Hale, who wrote, "If a man be desperately assaulted and in peril of death, and cannot otherwise escape, unless, to satisfy his assailant's fury, he will kill an innocent person then present, the fear and actual force will not acquit him of the crime and punishment of murder, for he ought rather to die himself than kill an innocent. But if he cannot otherwise save his own life, the law permits him in his own defense to kill the assailant, for by the violence of the assault, and the offense committed upon him by the assailant himself, the law of nature and necessity hath made him his own protector." Essentially, one has no right to kill an innocent person to protect one's own life, but if someone is attacking you, they are no longer innocent as a result of their unjustified violence. Hence, you now have a right to use deadly force if that is the only way to protect yourself. As a side note, Hale was a contemporary of Thomas Hobbes, and while his language may sound similar to that of Hobbes, the view that Hale is advocating for is a bit more nuanced. Lord Hale was trying to balance the right to self-defense with other obligations we owe to others in society, whereas Hobbes' idea of self-defense was rooted in his notion of a right to preserve one's own life, a right that trumped every law, obligation, and even the will of the sovereign. R. v. Dudley and Stevens established a crucial precedent in common law. Necessity would no longer be a defense for murder. This case is still studied by law students around the world, forcing us to grapple with difficult questions of morality, survival, and the limits of the law. Besides the question of when, if ever, it might be justified to engage in cannibalism, there is also the question of what is the best way for society to deal with a known cannibal. Can a cannibal be reformed? Should they be placed in prison? Should they be institutionalized and treated as a mental health patient? Or should they simply be released back into society? The next case we'll examine involves a bizarre exploration of this very topic. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949, in Kobe, Japan. He came from a wealthy family. His father, Akira Sagawa, was a businessman who served as president of Kurita Water Industries, while his grandfather had been an editor for the Asahi Shimbun. Sagawa was born prematurely, and his fragile health and introverted personality growing up led him to develop a strong interest in literature. However, he also experienced disturbing urges from a young age. He first experienced cannibalistic desires as early as the first grade. Sagawa attended Waco University and then completed a master's degree in English literature at Kwansei Gakuin University. At the age of 24, while at Waco University, Sagawa attempted his first violent act. He followed a young German woman home and broke into her apartment while she was sleeping. His intention was to cannibalize her, but she awoke and thwarted his attack. Sagawa was captured and charged with attempted rape, though he didn't confess his true intentions. The charges were later dropped when his father paid for a settlement with the victim. In 1977, at the age of 28, Sagawa moved to Paris to pursue a PhD in literature at the Sorbonne. It was here that his disturbing fantasies would culminate in a horrific act. On June 11, 1981, Sagawa, then 32, invited his classmate, Renee Hartvelt, a 25-year-old Dutch woman, to his apartment under the pretext of translating poetry together. Sagawa had selected Hartvelt for her health and beauty, characteristics he felt he lacked. He considered himself weak, ugly, and small, standing at just 4 feet 9 inches tall, while Hartvelt was 5 feet 10 inches. Sagawa later claimed he wanted to absorb her energy. What followed was a crime of unimaginable brutality. I won't go into the full details, but I will say that Sagawa shot Hartvelt with a rifle and then consumed various parts of her body over the next several days. He also photographed each stage of his heinous crime. 4 days after the murder, Sagawa was caught attempting to dispose of Hartveldt's remains in the Bois de Boulogne Park and was promptly arrested by French police. Sagawa was then held for 2 years awaiting trial, during which time he was examined by French psychiatrists. Eventually, French judge Jean-Louis Bruguière found Sagawa legally insane and unfit to stand trial. You might remember from our previous episode that the defense of not guilty by reason of insanity, if accepted by a court, ultimately means that the defendant did not commit a crime, because he lacked the proper mens rea to be held accountable for his actions. Despite not being guilty of a crime, such defendants are typically placed in a mental institution so that they can receive treatment and the general public will be kept safe. Sagawa was set to be institutionalized in France, but the French public protested, as they are known for doing. Members of the public felt that their tax money should not be used to provide for a monster like Sagawa, and ultimately it is the Japanese government that should be responsible for providing for him. Following the public pressure, Sagawa was deported to Japan. Upon his return, he was examined by psychologists at Matsuzawa Hospital in Tokyo. Their conclusion? Sagawa was found to be sane. As a result, Sagawa could not be detained in Japan. The charges against him in France had been dropped after he was found not guilty. The French court documents were also sealed and not released to the Japanese authorities. And, according to the Japanese doctors, Sagawa did not have a mental condition that would require him to be institutionalized. Hence, Sagawa checked himself out of the hospital on August 12, 1986, and walked out a free man. As a side note, there has been some speculation that the findings of the Japanese psychologists who examined Sagawa may have been encouraged by some quid pro quo from Sagawa's wealthy family. Sagawa found himself in a strange situation. He was free, but everyone knew what he had done. He still needed to pay for food and rent, but no one wanted to hire a self-confessed cannibal. However, Sagawa discovered that he had a strange following, a group of fans that were fascinated by him and were willing to sponsor his creative endeavors. Between 1986 and 1997, Sagawa was frequently invited to be a guest speaker and commentator at gatherings. He wrote books and worked with artists on illustrated novels and comic books based on the murder he committed. He even worked as a restaurant reviewer for the Japanese magazine Spa. In 2013, Sagawa was hospitalized from a cerebral infarction, which permanently damaged his nervous system. And then, on November 24, 2022, at the age of 73, he died of pneumonia. The case of Issei Sagawa remains one of the most disturbing examples of how legal technicalities can sometimes fail to deliver justice. It serves as a stark reminder of the need for better international cooperation in criminal cases and more standardized approaches to mental health evaluations in legal proceedings. So if a cannibal cannot argue necessity or bribe someone for a clean bill of mental health, how else might a defendant try to justify their culinary killings? What if they were actually able to obtain their victims' consent? On March 9, 2001, in the small German town of Rottenburg an der Fulda, Armin Muse, a 39-year-old computer technician, met with Bernd Jürgen Armando Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin. What transpired next was a disturbing act of consensual cannibalism that would captivate and repulse the public for years to come. Muse had posted an online advertisement on a website called The Cannibal Cafe, stating he was looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. Brandes, responding to this ad, willingly traveled to Muse's home with the intention of being killed and eaten. The two men made a videotape of their encounter, which would later become crucial evidence. Again, the series of events that followed are too grotesque to recount, Suffice it to say, Muse did exactly what his partner volunteered for, resulting in Muse killing Brandes and consuming parts of him over the next 10 months. Muse was arrested in December 2002 when a college student alerted authorities to new advertisements that Muse had placed online, again seeking consenting adults. When investigators searched his home, they found human remains and the videotape of Brandes's killing. In January 2004, Muse was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years and 6 months in prison. This verdict sparked considerable debate. How could a clear case of killing result in only a manslaughter conviction? Well, to the surprise of the public and even the German authorities, cannibalism itself was not specifically outlawed in Germany. As a side note, cannibalism is not specifically outlawed in many American states either. According to Cornell Law School's Legal Information Institute, in the United States, there are no laws against cannibalism per se, but most, if not all, states have enacted laws that indirectly make it impossible to legally obtain and consume body matter. Murder, for instance, is a likely criminal charge, regardless of any consent. Further, even if someone consents to being eaten and ends their own life, the cannibal may still be liable for criminal or civil actions based on laws governing the abuse or desecration of a corpse, which vary by jurisdiction. Arguably, the German court in this case gave some weight to the consent of the victim in choosing to find the defendant guilty of the lesser crime of manslaughter. The prosecution then appealed the verdict, arguing that Muse should have been convicted of murder. They contended that he killed for sexual gratification, a motive they believed was proved by the contents of the videotape evidence. In May 2006, a court in Frankfurt convicted Muse of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. This retrial and its outcome raise fascinating questions about the nature of consent, the limits of personal autonomy, and the role of motive in determining the severity of a crime. Since his conviction, Muse has become a vegetarian and an advocate for cannibalism prevention. He has expressed remorse for his actions and has participated in interviews to discuss the psychological factors that led to his crime. He has actually been described as a model prisoner. Also, interestingly, in 2020, the German Federal Constitutional Court ruled that the 2015 law prohibiting assisted suicide was unconstitutional. If this case were to have happened in Germany today, it's possible that the defendant would have argued that his actions merely constituted assisted suicide. Turning to our final topic, what if full-on cannibalism is biting off more than one can chew, so to speak? There are a variety of activities we might refer to as quasi-cannibalism. These are activities that, while not involving the direct consumption of human flesh in the traditional sense, still raise ethical and legal questions about the use of human body parts or tissues for consumption. What about the legality of those actions? One form of quasi-cannibalism is placenta consumption. This practice has gained attention in recent years, with some celebrities claiming it helps combat postpartum depression and increases milk production among new mothers. However, the legal status of this practice varies. In some states, like Oregon, Hawaii, and Texas, there are specific laws allowing mothers to take their placenta home after birth. Other states treat the placenta as medical waste, requiring court orders or special permissions for removal from the hospital. Some hospitals will allow placenta removal with a signed liability waiver. The legal complexity arises from the placenta's classification as medical waste under laws like the Medical Waste Tracking Act, which was originally designed to address concerns about syringes and other medical waste washing up on beaches, thereby posing a public health risk. Another form of quasi-cannibalism that has emerged in recent years is the consumption of cremated human remains. While this may seem unthinkable, there have been several reported cases. In 2018, a California high school student baked cookies containing her grandfather's ashes and distributed them to her classmates. Also, recently, a woman in Australia admitted to eating some of her grandmother's ashes and secretly adding them to her brother's pasta sauce. Again, in many jurisdictions, there are no specific laws against consuming cremated remains. In the California cookie case, authorities couldn't find any applicable criminal statutes, so they left it up to the school and the parents of the girl to find a suitable resolution to the matter. However, as we have noted, many states do have pre-existing laws about how human remains are supposed to be handled. Society will continue to grapple with these issues, confronting new and more bizarre instances of human behavior, making it increasingly likely that we'll see more specific legislation addressing these practices in the future. Until then, the legal status of quasi-cannibalism remains unsettled and unsettling. As we conclude our exploration of cannibalistic court cases, we're left with more questions than answers. From mothers munching on placenta to sailors binging on cabin boys, we've seen that the boundaries between the taboo and the permissible are often blurrier than we might expect. These cases challenge our legal systems, forcing us to account for scenarios that lawmakers find completely unpalatable. They raise profound questions about bodily autonomy, cultural practices, and the limits of personal freedom. Wrapping up this episode of The Dark Docket, I encourage you to consider what other taboos courts choose to weigh in on. What is taboo to one society may very well be perfectly accepted in another. How are courts supposed to handle cases where conflict arises because of societal or cultural differences? How should courts balance tolerance with respect for public safety? And when it comes to taboos such as the sharing of personal information and data, how should courts balance the interests of wealthy companies and governments with respect for individual privacy? Thank you for joining us for this rather grisly discussion. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Dark Docket on whatever venue you tune in on. If you know of any interesting legal cases that involve the supernatural or the strange, please feel free to write to us at darkdocket@gmail.com. Join us next time as we continue to examine the complex intersection between the law and the world beyond. Until then, remember, you are what you eat.